Help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Relato 1. I have always been afraid of cemeteries, especially at night. I don't know if it's the absolute silence or the feeling that you're never really alone. So when my friend Tom suggested we explore the town's abandoned cemetery, my response was an emphatic first no. But Tom was persistent. He said the place was rumored to be haunted and that many locals avoided passing by even during the day. It's just a legend, he said, laughing. Against my better judgment, I agreed to go. I should have trusted my instinct. The cemetery was buried at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by tall trees that blocked almost all the moonlight. We arrived around 11 p.m. with flashlights and a camera that Tom wanted to use to document the adventure. The rusty iron gate was ajar, creaking in the wind, as if inviting us to enter. Inside, the atmosphere was even darker. The gravestones were worn down by time, covered in moss, and many were toppled or broken in half. The smell of damp earth was strong, and the silence was oppressive. "It's not that bad," Tom said, trying to sound confident as he illuminated the path with his flashlight. But I knew he was just as nervous as I was. We walked slowly among the gravestones, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. The wind made the trees whisper, and small rustling in the bushes caused me to look back every few seconds. Tom was excited, taking pictures and reading the inscriptions on the gravestones aloud. Some dated back over 100 years, and many were in languages we couldn't understand. That's when I found the mausoleum. It was a small structure with an iron door that looked like it had been forced shut. There were scratch marks on the aged wood, as if someone or something had tried to get in or out. "This is incredible," Tom said, pointing the camera at the door. He pushed the door with effort, and it creaked open. The interior was small, with a single gravestone in the center and a strong smell of something we couldn't identify. "Should we go in?" he asked, looking at me. I hesitated, but before I could respond, he was already inside. As Tom explored the mausoleum, I stayed outside, illuminating the cemetery with my flashlight. That's when I heard a sound. A faint crack coming from somewhere to my left. "Tom, did you hear that?" I wanted to ask, but he didn't respond. I looked inside the mausoleum and saw him fiddling with the camera, completely oblivious to what was happening. The sound grew louder, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. I shone my light toward the noise, but saw nothing but gravestones and trees. Suddenly, Tom burst out of the mausoleum, pale. "Something moved in there," he said, panting. Before I could respond, we heard another sound. This time, it was like a low breath coming from behind us. We turned simultaneously, shining our flashlights in the area. At first, we saw nothing, but then, behind a tall gravestone, a figure appeared. It was a man, or at least he appeared to be. He was dressed in old, tattered clothes, and his face was partially covered by shadows. His eyes were sunken, and he was watching us without moving. "Hey, who are you?" Tom shouted, but the man didn't respond. He just tilted his head awkwardly, as if analyzing us. Suddenly, he took a step toward us. That was enough to make us run. We dashed among the gravestones, trying to find the gate, but it felt like the cemetery had changed. Every path we took led us back to the mausoleum. As we ran, the sound of footsteps grew louder. They weren't ours. They were heavy, fast, and seemed to be following closely behind us. "This way," Tom shouted, pointing to a narrow path between the trees. We followed it, but just before we reached the exit, something happened. Tom tripped and fell, dropping the camera. When I went to help him, I looked back and saw the man again. He was standing still, but something had changed. His face was more visible now, and there was something wrong with his skin. It was pale, almost translucent, as if he wasn't really alive. I grabbed Tom by the arm, and we kept running until we finally found the gate. As soon as we exited the cemetery, the sound of footsteps stopped. I looked back, and the man was there, standing at the gate. He watched us but didn't interfere. We returned to the car in silence, not looking back. When we got home, Tom reviewed the photos on the camera. Most were normal, but one left us speechless. It was a picture of the mausoleum, taken before we entered. In the corner of the image, we could clearly see the man standing behind one of the gravestones, watching us the whole time. I don't know who or what he was, but I know I will never return to that cemetery. Sometimes at night I hear footsteps outside my window, as if someone is slowly walking down the sidewalk. Some places should remain forgotten. Report 2. About a year ago, I accepted the absurd idea of a friend. Kyle insisted that we explore an old cemetery outside of town. The place was known for sinister stories, but I was never the type to believe in such things. He said people heard voices and saw strange lights. It was just a silly challenge, I thought. We went at night, as if to make the experience even more uncomfortable. I had no idea that decision would change the way I viewed the world forever. We arrived at the cemetery around 10 p.m. The main gate was rusted, falling apart. The place was completely isolated, surrounded by dense trees that formed a natural wall. The only light came from our flashlights, and our silence was almost oppressive. Kyle was excited, walking ahead and commenting on the gravestones. The inscriptions were almost faded, some dating back to the early last century. There was no sign that anyone had taken care of the place in decades. We walked to the heart of the cemetery, where we found a large stone tomb. Kyle wanted to explore closer, but something bothered me. I felt as if we were being watched, even though there was nothing but darkness around us. As Kyle took pictures, he noticed something strange. There was a gravestone with a completely worn-out name, but around it, the grass seemed darker, almost black. Something about it felt out of place. "Kyle, look at this," I called, pointing. He moved closer, but before he could respond, we heard a sound coming from somewhere near us. A crack, as if someone had stepped on a twig. We froze for a moment, trying to listen better. The sound returned, now clearer, like slow footsteps. We turned our flashlights in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing there. "It must be the wind," Kyle said, laughing, but I knew that wasn't natural. We continued walking, but the sound unsettled us, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. Finally, we reached a small chapel at the back of the cemetery. The door was open, swaying slightly. Kyle, as always, insisted on going inside. I hesitated, but eventually followed. The interior was small and empty, with overturned wooden benches and burnt-out candles scattered across the floor. On the altar, there was an upside-down crucifix. Kyle found that interesting and started taking more pictures. As he fiddled with the camera, I heard something that made me freeze. A whisper, low, almost imperceptible, but coming from inside the chapel. "Kyle, shut up," I whispered. He looked at me confused. "Did you hear that?" Before he could respond, the whisper grew louder. It wasn't just one, but several, as if a crowd was murmuring around us. Suddenly, the door behind us slammed shut. The sound echoed, and the fallen candles on the floor began to move, as if pushed by something invisible. "Let's get out of here," I said, pulling Kyle. But as we turned to the door, we saw something that made me freeze. A shadow was there, blocking the exit. It was tall, darker than the darkness itself, and seemed to vibrate slightly, as if struggling to maintain its form. And Kyle tried to shine his flashlight on the shadow, but the light seemed to be swallowed. The thing stepped forward, and the wooden floor creaked. Without thinking, we ran to the back of the chapel, looking for another way out. I found a small side door and managed to force it open. We bolted into the cemetery, but it felt like the place had changed. The gravestones that were once scattered were now aligned in perfect rows, as if someone had planned to reorganize them. The trees around the cemetery were closer, as if they wanted to encircle us. As we ran, we heard footsteps behind us. They weren't ours. They were heavy, rhythmic, as if someone or something was following us. "Kyle, don't look back," I shouted, but he didn't hear me. When he looked, he fell to his knees, trembling. I saw," he murmured, but couldn't finish the sentence. Finally, I found the main gate. It was closed, but I managed to climb over it and get out. When we reached the car, Kyle was still in shock, unable to speak. We drove back to town in silence. When we finally got to my house, he looked at me and said just one thing: "Never mention this again." Since that night, we never spoke about the cemetery again. But sometimes I dream of that place. I dream of the chapel, the shadow at the door, and the footsteps that follow our every move. Kyle moved away months later without warning. Recently, I received a message from him. He wanted nothing, just a photo, the cemetery gate with the chapel in the background. I don't know why he went back, but I know one thing: I never set foot there again. Report 3. Cemeteries have always made me uncomfortable. It wasn't a fear of ghosts or anything supernatural, but a heavy atmosphere that seemed to be ingrained in every tombstone, as if the air carried the weight of all the stories that ended there. So when my cousin Claire met me to go to the cemetery where she worked as a caretaker, I hesitated. She had always liked quiet places and said that the cemetery was peaceful at night. I, on the other hand, thought the idea of spending hours surrounded by graves was simply wrong. But she insisted, saying she needed help to close the main gate and do one last inspection. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We arrived at the cemetery just before 10 p.m. The main entrance was imposing, with 2 tall rusted iron gates that creaked when pushed. Claire had a flashlight and a bunch of keys hanging from her belt. She seemed comfortable there, as if she were already accustomed to the darkness and oppressive silence. "The place is bigger than it looks," she commented as we walked among the rows of tombstones. Indeed, the cemetery seemed to stretch on forever, with ancient trees blocking some of the moonlight. At first, everything seemed calm. The sound of our footsteps on the gravel and the soft rustling of leaves were the only noises. But as we moved forward, I began to notice something, a strange feeling that we were being followed. Claire was ahead, checking to see if the graves were intact. Some were so old that the inscriptions were unreadable, while others were just newly placed, with fresh flowers beside them. "Do you always come here alone?" I asked, trying to disguise my discomfort. "Almost always," she replied, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "But today I need help because one of the lights in the mausoleum isn't working." The mausoleum was buried in the oldest part of the cemetery, surrounded by tombstones over a century old. When we got there, we felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold wind of the night. The stone structure was partially covered in moss, and the iron door was ajar, swaying slightly. "Who left it like this?" I asked, trying to hide the fear in my voice. "No one should have touched this," Claire replied, frowning. She pushed the door open slowly, and the flashlight illuminated the interior. The space was small, with only a few tombs and a strong smell of wet earth mixed with something more disturbing. As Claire checked the broken light, I stood at the entrance, trying not to think about how the place felt colder than the rest of the cemetery. That's when I heard it. It was a low sound, like a faint scratching coming from inside the mausoleum. "Claire, did you hear that?" I asked, trying to stay calm. She looked at me with curiosity, but before she could respond, the sound grew louder. Now it was unmistakable. Something or someone was scratching the stone floor. Claire pointed her flashlight to the back of the mausoleum, but there was nothing there. Still, the sound continued, as if it were coming from beneath us. "It could be a trapped animal," she suggested, but she looked just as scared as I felt. Suddenly, the mausoleum door slammed shut with a bang. Claire rushed to open it, but it was locked from the inside. That's when the flashlight's beam began to flicker. "This isn't right," I murmured, feeling my heart race. The sound of scratching changed. It now sounded like something was climbing up the walls. I looked up, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow moving on the ceiling. Claire managed to open the door, and we bolted outside. When we were a few meters from the mausoleum, we stopped to catch our breath. The silence had returned, but now it felt wrong, as if the cemetery itself were watching us. "Let's finish this and get out of here," Claire said, trying to sound brave. We walked back toward the main gate, but something was different. The tombstones seemed to have changed places. Paths that had once been clear were now blocked, and the feeling of being followed was stronger than ever. Then we saw it. Near a tree, a figure was standing. It was hard to tell what it was, but it looked human. It wore something like a dark cloak, and its face was hidden in shadow. "Hey!" Claire called, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, watching us. When we took another step, the figure began to walk toward us. Its movements were erratic, as if it was struggling against something. "Run!" I shouted, and we started sprinting toward the gate. When we finally reached the gate, it was locked. Claire tried to open it with the keys, but her hands were shaking so much that she couldn't get them into the lock. I looked back and saw that the figure was now just a few meters away from us. Up close, I realized it wasn't a cloak it was wearing, but tattered clothes covered in dirt, as if it had just crawled out of a grave. Claire finally managed to unlock the gate, and we rushed to the car. When we got in, she started the engine, and we drove away without looking back. That night still feels like it happened yesterday. Claire asked for a transfer weeks later, and I never returned to that cemetery. Some places should remain untouched, and some doors should never be opened.